Marshall here. Welcome back to the YouTube version of the Realignment podcast. My guest today is HKS professor Moshik Temkin. We're talking about his new book. It's called Warriors, Rebels, and Saints. It's all about models for leadership and whether or not individual leaders can produce transformative change. In this conversation, we discuss movements, why previous movements, especially during the 2010s and early 2020s, have failed to transform the country, and how this all plays into the 2024 election, which clearly is going to come down to a leadership contest between President Joe Biden or former President Trump. And of course, all this is going to have deep significance for our country moving forward, especially because we're clearly going through a leadership transition as the silent generation represented by Joe Biden and, of course, the baby boom generation represented by Donald Trump are clearly moving aside in favor of Gen X, millennials, and, of course, Gen Z. Hope you all enjoy the conversation, and definitely let me know what you think in the comments below. Moshik Temkin, welcome to the Realignment.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to speak with you. I'm increasingly interested in the broad topic of leadership as you're applying it in this book, because the Realignment, we have episodes on history, we have episodes on public policy, we have episodes on the news. And what I think is interesting about the course that you teach and the place that you sit within the Harvard Kennedy School specifically is integrating these policy challenges within a framework of leadership and history. So that's exactly the place we're trying to hit at. So let's just open up with a question that you start all of your classes off by asking. Do leaders make history, or does history make leaders? So a couple multi-parts to this question. First question, can you explain the meaning and significance of this question?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's true. I do open every class, every course, every time I teach this course, whether it was at Harvard or anywhere else that I've been teaching it elsewhere as well. I start with the question. And one of the things that makes it such a good question, I think, is that there is no easy or obvious answer. And it can drive a whole course, right? And I think in a sense, it drives this whole book. And I think that it comes from this sort of, these two sides, these two things that I'm looking at the same time. One is, right, there's the leader, right? In history, you can think of names like whether it's Winston Churchill or Abraham Lincoln or Joan of Arc, whatever name you come up with. These are significant people, right? That they changed the world, or they changed their community, right? They made an impact. So we're very drawn to this. And there's of course, this is source of many books, films. It sort of inspires us, and it's very human. But at the same time, any one of these people that you think of comes from somewhere. They're the product, and they emerge from situations in history, right? Whether it's a crisis or a conflict or a war, or a series of events that happens that produces both the need for such a leader, but also the person himself or herself. And so my question to students, to readers, in a way, is which one of these things is more important? Is it the leader sort of making history, creating change, or is it the circumstances, the events, right? The crisis, the conflict that actually creates this leader in the first place? And I think by looking at those two things together, we really understand the dynamics of how leadership actually works in history. For me, it's not about just, one individual changing everything, but it's also not just about events happening, without any kind of individual leader having an impact. It's really a combination of those two things.
I guess the instant response that comes to mind, though, is just, I'm usually just going to elevate leaders beyond circumstance and history, just because different leaders respond to historical moments and public policy challenges in different ways across these various examples, right? So, for example, post 2016, I would define the political situation, quote unquote, as post-Cold War consensus has broken down. That has left established institutions with a severe deficit of credibility and ability to kind of impose whatever their conception of the correct answer or response is. You've had two different presidents who, in their own ways, intellectual or not, articulate some version of that, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but they've taken their responses in very different directions. That's why I just personally, at an analytical level, like to focus on the individual leader. I'm curious, like, what your response to that is.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way of looking at it. I think you're right to identify 2016 as a sort of a significant year. But here's the question. Is 2016 significant because of, a leader that emerges, let's say Trump? This is a topic that we've all been obsessing over for years now, right? If Trump emerges as president, becomes president in 2016, we look at that as a kind of a turning point, and we want to see the impact of this individual on our society, on our politics. But I'm a historian, so I'm not satisfied with that. I want to understand how we even got to the place where a guy like Donald Trump gets elected in the first place, right? What has to happen in a society, in a political economy, in global geopolitics, in a whole range of factors that creates that need or that sort of, demand in the first place? So 2016 produces things, right? The post 2016 is very interesting to look at, of course, but I'm interested in 2016 as a product as well. I think of Donald Trump as, you can say he's a cause of things, but I also see him as an effect. I see him as a symptom. I see him as a result of a lot of things that, by the way, a lot of our kind of going on a rant here, but I think a lot of our media and a lot of our analysts, a lot of our pundits kind of sometimes avoid talking about. They focus on Trump to a large extent because they are not always eager to see the various ways in which many institutions in American society, in particular elite institutions, and have created conditions that, I'm not going to say that they just by themselves create Trump, but they certainly facilitated his way to the top. And even Joe Biden, think about it. Who would have thought Joe Biden would be elected president 10 years ago, 20 years ago? He was becoming Barack Obama's vice president was seen overwhelmingly as the summit of his political career. No knock on Joe Biden, but even Joe Biden's election in 2020, I think, largely should be understood as itself as a product of the Trump era, right? The election of Biden, in a way, cannot be understood without having Trump before him as president.
Yeah, and I think good question just to ask you, because like we said, we're going to go a bunch of different places in this conversation, but I'm in the age cohort. I'm 31. So I'm in the middle-aged millennial cohort that I think a lot of your like past students have fallen into. And I have just noticed, especially since after I graduated high school, so after 2010, leadership as a concept seems to have fallen out of fashion. Here's what I mean by that. If you read any coverage of Occupy Wall Street in 2011, very early on in the reporting or even in the movement self-conceptualization, they would say things like, we are a leaderless organization. Look at the Arab Spring, especially in Egypt. Like, you definitely had certain spokespeople, definitely people who could usually speak English or were more fluent in Western media, but they were spokespeople. They weren't like the leaders. There isn't just one figure. And then if you look at the BLM movement post 2020, a consistent feature of, once again, this discourse was, we are leaderless. There may be chapters, but there's no one big grand speaker for this movement. Now, to give my biases away, I think this has been a disastrous overcompensation in the complete wrong direction. I think the various failures of these movements are directly attributable to the rejection of leadership as a concept. So, having given my bias, I just love to hear, as someone who teaches leadership to millennials, if you've witnessed the distaste for leadership at a narrative level in your classroom and in the spaces you inhabit.
Marshall, that's a really interesting question. Let me answer in two different ways, okay? And let's see if I can actually keep track of these two things connecting. The first is, I think you're absolutely right that these movements that you mentioned, among others, did have that model, right? A kind of a collective, right? They reject hierarchy. They think of leadership maybe in that sort of old-fashioned sense, and they're forward-looking in that way. And I agree that this is a very flawed model for real political and social change. But I think that I put this in larger context. They're themselves, these movements are the products of an era in which it has been proclaimed by thinkers, by political philosophers, by high profile writers and journalists and academics, that we were at the end of history. And also that there were these forces in our society that were more powerful than any sort of individual could change, right? Whether we're talking about capitalism or whether we're talking about these sort of globalization and various sort of ideas came about that were steadily marching into this world in which we ourselves as individuals or even as small groups have very little control over. And I think that these movements, in a sense, rather than rebelling against all that, they kind of adopted that kind of thinking that leadership was over. So while I'm agreeing with your sort of observation, I'd ask us to kind of broaden our scope and see that we're really talking about a vast moment of rejection of leadership, or a skepticism about leadership. And we even heard leaders over many years often claim, hey, I have very little power. I can't change things, when there was a demand for change very often, right? And that's also another way to understand our current moment and a kind of rebellion against that. The second thing is, you asked about, I guess, millennials. It's not just millennials. I think there is a hunger for leadership, but it's not any leadership. I think people are looking for different kind of leadership, right? It's if you suggest to people, well, are you willing to rally around someone who actually successfully vocalizes your aspirations and is able to organize people? Very often the answer that at least I heard in my classes and audiences, people that I talk to, is, yes, we would like that, but very few people are stepping up. And when they do step up, they're often kind of crushed, or there's a lot of pettiness and jealousies and sort of all kinds of factors that come into play to prevent that. So I'm a little bit old fashioned, and I think that you're right that leadership has gone out of fashion, but I don't think it's gone out of people's wants and needs. I think there is a hunger for good leadership. I hear it all the time, including from young people.
So I guess what I'd like to understand then is what is happening. So this is really interesting, because when we break this up into three distinct millennial and Gen Z coded social movements. So BLM, which really follows Ferguson in 2014, picks up back again as a specific movement after George Floyd's murder in 2020. And then, of course, March for Our Lives, young Gen Zers in the wake of the Parkland shooting. Given what you said, when you actually talk to people, they desire leadership. They're interested in someone who could vocalize their aspirations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why then, in the cases of the three social movements I just identified, did the initial organizers or framers of these movements automatically upfront reject the idea that there was a leader or even specific set of leaders? So it's not just a matter of David Hogg is proclaiming that he's a leader. You could have had two or three other people who are explicitly saying we've assumed a co-equal leadership structure. You just haven't seen that. So I'd love to hear your kind of HKS theory of the case here. Why when leaders actually, or why when people who could seize leadership, why do they reject it when they've done the already hard task of coalescing an initial movement, which in of itself is an act of leadership?
Yeah, so if you turn to history, let's look at two cases in American history, actually, that I think are relevant here. That complicate matters for us. I hate to do this to complicate things, right?
No, this is the
Historians
purpose
love
of
to
this
complicate
conversation.
things, but I sometimes we have to do that. So let's look at first even the suffragist movement that was spanned 4 generations. It took basically almost a century of struggle for women to get what we now take for granted, which is the right to vote. Now, the suffragist movement never really had one leader. There were various parts to it. It was also a segregated movement. So then you had, the white leaders, and you had the black leaders, and then you had the more radical wing of the movement, the Alice Paul wing, and then you had the more institutional wing of the movement. Carrie Chapman Catt. And by the way, these leaders sometimes didn't talk to each other at all.
Mm-hmm.
And they sometimes were very hostile, right? They had very different visions of how to achieve the goal, and very different visions for what would happen after they achieved the goal. But in the case of the suffragist movement, you might make the argument that it was because it was coming at it from different directions that the overall pressure in the end became significant enough to really achieve the change of bringing about the 19th Amendment, right? So I think I wouldn't totally discredit the idea of a movement that has multiple poles of leadership or different sorts of leadership. And remember that with informal group, this is not an institution, this is not a government, this is not an army or a multinational corporation. This is a movement. So it's very hard to determine in a very official way who is the leader of the movement. Similarly, the so-called civil rights movement, that term is used in a very broad way, basically to encompass any significant African-American leader in the post-war era from, the 40s beyond and all the way up into the 80s or even later. But even in that movement, think about, the differences between, let's say, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. They had very different views, both on the origins of what African Americans were facing in American society, right, the history, and about what would be the solution, right? What was the way forward? So there was never one official leader of the African American struggle in the United States, mainly because, again, we're talking about a kind of on the one hand, it's a very vast social movement, but it has no formal institutional mechanisms by which to choose an accepted leader. So I would say, Marshall, in general, it's hard to expect one person to be seen as the formal leader. Who do I talk to in the civil rights movement? Oh, I talk to this guy, right? That's not how these things work. So I think that's part of what makes social movements, as opposed to a formal body or organization. On the other hand, to be kind of fair to your point, I think that there need to be at least some people who are visible, certain people who are identifiable, that you can sort of turn to even be the spokespeople. Right. In the cases that I agree with you. When I think about the movements that you talk about, it's harder to identify, someone with that kind of gravitas, someone with that kind of power and voice. Part of it is also, I think, the very different political and media environment that we're living in. Think about, back in the 1910s or 20s or even the 60s. There weren't, how many television channels were there in the 1960s, right? There was a lot less sort of, attention going in a million different places. Then there was no internet, there's no Facebook, there's no social media. In the 1920s, 1910s, forget about, there's no television, there's the radio, right? There are some, very specific places that people are turning to. So in many ways, it's easier to get attention in one place, in one direction. I think today, movements like this are at a disadvantage because they don't have the ability to really compel people to pay attention. Martin Luther King Jr., think about what an iconic figure he is. If he were sort of transposed to today as an activist, I don't know how much attention he'd get, Marshall. Even when you think about his opinions, when you think about what he actually had to say about the economy, about American capitalism, about militarism, I have my doubts how much he would even be able to get booked on television. So, it's very difficult, I think, in comparison to that era, to even be able to command an audience in the way that people did back then.
See, and this is where this gets fascinating, because if anything, my critique of modern conceptions of leadership, especially in the kind of popular culture that you and I swim in, is that it's overly focused on questions of like who's getting views, who's the spokesman, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because like when I'm interested in leadership, I do not disagree with you that the idea that why can't they just find a Gandhi or an MLK or a Nelson Mandela who can just be this figure and own everything and have the message, this, or that, putting aside all the various flaws and like issues that those three leaders would have had. I'm actually just focused on a basic structural organizational reality. Because since we're so focused on the idea that you can't truly just transpose MLK on the face of everything, we just ignore the fact that, okay, once again, let's go to the BLM context. And once again, like when I'm talking about these like social movements, these are also very, very controversial. So I'm not quite asking you to like comment on their exact public policy aims. But like on a practical level, like let's look at a huge problem that Black Lives Matter has had. Because it's not actually an organization. There actually aren't any real standards for what constitutes an actual statement that's put out. So, for example, after Hamas's attacks on Israel on October 7th, putting aside what happened afterwards, you had the BLM chapter in Chicago put out a picture of a paraglider and tying it to BLM. Now, obviously, on 15 different levels, I think that is a bad call. Putting aside like the debate over Palestinian solidarity with communities of color in the United States, identifying the paraglider and that specific act of violence, I personally think was a bad call. But guess what? Maybe that's the right call, but I think it needs to be adjudicated. I think there needs to be someone who is above the Chicago chapter who could say, hey, let's talk this through. Oh my God, maybe this big event just happened. What if we hit pause and put out a statement tomorrow? X, Y, and Z. I'm talking about process. I'm talking about focus. Everything I just described has nothing to do with like whether or not I can get views on Twitter, booked on CNN. I'm just talking about basic processes that would prevent problems from happening. I think the other example you had happen during BLM is because you had these individual chapters without deep structure, you had kind of different fundraising apparati, you had different pools of money. So you had certain chapter heads that kind of spend the money buying themselves like a home that's like charged to the chapter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm basically just talking about the aspect of leadership that just says, hey, I'm going to look over the books. And before the media finds out about this, if I find out that you're doing this, or that sketchily, you're going to be held accountable by someone who's above you in the hierarchy. I'm focused on that side of leadership. So I know I just kind of like ranted to you. This is kind of like my set of hullabaloos, but I'd love to hear your response to that side of leadership, separate from just views and, who's getting booked on Meet the Press.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is Black Lives Matter. I don't want to speak out of expertise, right? This is not, I'm not an expert on Black Lives Matter, but it's my impression that it's not quite, we can't really speak about Black Lives Matter as a formal institution or organization. It's really a cause. And there are people who are sort of speaking in the name of that cause, and they have some degree of, they have the local chapters and so on and so forth. But you're right that I don't think that there's any sort of oversight or any clear sort of structure that would make sure that the right message is being put across at the national level or at the international level. And there is definitely a need for that. I'm not talking about Black Lives Matter. I think any social movement that really wants to create change has to think about these issues. They have to think about organization. They have to think about strategy at a high level. And there have to be people who are sort of, that's their job, right? To not just to discipline, but also to organize, to make sure that things work. These organizations, let's face it, they're not, contrary to what I think a lot of my colleagues or pundits or analysts think, they're not very powerful. They don't hold the power in the United States or in the world. They're still movements. They're often young people. They're often students. They don't decide per se what our society looks like, and they're under a lot of pressure. And there's also, let's face it, a lot of backlash that they face, including on these matters that you just talked about. So in that environment, you have to be extra careful, and you have to be extra smart. Right. I think just to go back to the civil rights example, I think that, whether we look at Martin Luther King Jr. or any other sort of serious civil rights leader of that era, they were very disciplined and actually very organized, as best as they could in the context of their times, to make sure not just that there's a hierarchy or that there's a figure who represents everybody, but that there's a plan. Right. And that there is also decisions, the main decision that these sorts of movements have to decide on when they want to, not just to speak about things that are happening, but also to create changes. To what extent do they want to work with the formal powers that be? Mm-hmm. So maybe the main dividing line between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, just to give one example. They had many ideological differences, but I think a big one was, do we cooperate with the American state, right, the government, or not? Are we even part of this project, the United States of America? For Martin Luther King Jr., he was very radical, and he was a socialist, but he believed that the Constitution said certain things, and that the Declaration of Independence said certain things, and that there was an American dream that could be lived up to, mm-hmm. right? And that the way forward for Black people in the United States was through the transformation of the country and the nation and its institutions and its laws. Malcolm X, on the other hand, did not believe in the American project. He rejected the United States at its core. He rejected that model. He wanted nothing to do with the United States. So his approach was, I do not cooperate with the American state. I do not cooperate with the United States of America. I'm a revolutionary in that sense, and I go outside it. So it's really, are you inside and cooperating with institutions, or are you outside? It's not even a matter of how committed you are. It's really an approach of how you see change happening.
I'd love to hear thoughts on the MLK versus Malcolm X setup, because Malcolm X's name is in the title of the book. The reason why I'm interested in this is what I have just picked up, having interviewed a lot of policymakers, interviewed a lot of activists, interviewed historians such as yourself, is that I think there are different types of people, not inherently through blood or genetics, but just over time, once again, your experiences, your life, how your circumstances evolve, how you respond to the moment, where you just have different mentalities. And I think because I am someone who succeeds within institutions, yet is still obviously kind of skeptical of institutions, I am going to lean towards MLK in this debate. I work at UT. I work in think tanks. I came from a PhD and lawyer-educated household growing up. All of those details are going to contribute to me concluding that, look, in those debates, MLK was correct. I don't think Malcolm X was correct. At the same time, I definitely, from an empathy perspective, I think this is why being an interviewer is a helpful skill set. I understand 100% how Malcolm X got where he was, held the ways that he held, in ways that Malcolm X serves as a pressure point on the conciliator, politician-y types like me. But I guess all that said together, like, how do you think about that's how I interpret the MLK versus Malcolm X dynamic. I'm curious how you interpret, through even your own personal history and experiences, the way that we often set these, there's a recent book out, like the shield and the sword, right? Like, how do you think of these contrasts?
Yeah, I have to say I hesitated to have, because the last chapter in the book is does focus on MLK and Malcolm X, and the reason that Malcolm X is in the subtitle from Machiavelli, The Art of Leadership from Machiavelli to Malcolm X, is not because it's chronological, but because he's at the end of Machiavelli's at the beginning of the book and Malcolm X is at the end of the book. And I hesitated to put them together because there is that way of looking at them as sort of the two poles, one of them moderate and one of them militant. And there's a good cop, bad cop element in this, which I think is mostly about how liberal America, and especially white liberal America, tends to view this history, and how it's taught in schools and in high schools all over the country and in the world. And I thought it was, in a way, not respectful to their unique and distinctive histories, right? They come from very different places. You pointed out, right? There's class differences, right? Not everybody comes, if you're in the same movement or you have the same sort of, you're classified in the same way in America, you're not all the same. Martin Luther King Jr. grew up in the so-called black bourgeoisie of Atlanta, and his parents were educated, and he was educated, and he got a PhD in theology and all this, and he was within the mainstream of the church, so that puts him much more at the center of black life. And Malcolm X grows up basically fatherless and then motherless, and he doesn't finish the 9th grade, and he's from a much poorer background than MLK, and they're going to be very different just from the get-go. That there's the formation is different. One's from the South, the other's from the North. It's a very different kind of very different kind of environment, so that already sets them off on different paths. So I think that it's true that you or anyone else, any leader, is the product of the world they grew up in, the product of the system that they grew up in, and the education that they had, and who their parents were. And it's very important, and we should never underrate that. At the same time, you sometimes get surprises, right? Just to switch to a different example from American history, and I'll get back to this in a second. In 1932, even in 1929, forget 1932, in 1929, Herbert Hoover is president when the Depression hits. Now, Herbert Hoover got elected in 1928. He had never been elected to public office. Not a politician, but he's a widely admired person. And he's considered to be a brilliant, entrepreneur and humanitarian, very successful public servant. He comes from a fairly modest background. He kind of grew up in the middle of nowhere, Iowa. It's nothing fancy. And he's seen as very successful president until the Depression hits and crisis hits. And at that point, the public discovers that this man is not cut out for a crisis moment. And they turn to FDR. Now, FDR actually comes from the Hudson Valley in New York State. He comes from a very rich, privileged, insular background, as does his wife Eleanor. They're from the same place, more or less. And this aristocrat turns out to be much better at handling a crisis, and especially at appealing to the people, and particularly poor people who are struggling, people who are very skeptical about the system and about democracy and about capitalism. And so, Hoover is rejected for FDR, who was very successful. So, we would maybe expect, given their backgrounds, that it would be in some ways the opposite, but it's not. So there is room for individual distinctiveness and agency, and there's room for people to kind of transcend their social class or the role that one expects them to have based on where they come from. So I don't want to give the impression that there's just a determined path from one's childhood to what one becomes in the future. Then life would be very boring and predictable, and I probably wouldn't have written this book. I wrote this book because sometimes those things turns out to be true, right? And sometimes we get unexpected twists and turns.
And quick pause, and this is there are a variety of critiques one could level at Donald Trump, obviously, but the critique that I'm always the least interested in is, look at this guy. Let's put aside whether he's a billionaire or not. Look at this guy. He's so rich. He's so crass. How could he possibly be the embodiment of a populist movement that rejects many aspects of modern America. Obviously he can. Same as FDR, right? Like the FDR quote that I love about this dynamic is, he would do his like kind of whistle stop tours around the country, and a reporter interviewed like a farmer or a worker, probably a worker, after he spoke of FDR. And then the worker said, FDR is the only politician I've ever met who understood that my boss is a son of a bitch. And just at a core, like, and that explains FDR's political coalition. And once again, like, there's definitely like a Midwestern Trump version of that equivalent. So I think when we too focus on the obvious background gotchas or dunks, we miss the way that this stuff operationalizes it in the road. Okay, this is actually a great kind of pivot point. I'm glad you raised Herbert Hoover. I used to work on the reboot of Firing Line. This is William F. Buckley's old show, and it's hosted by Margaret Hoover, who is Herbert Hoover's great granddaughter. And I've been subject to many a revisionist take on Herbert Hoover. So I have to give this history real quick. Herbert Hoover, Kenneth Wright has a great biography. Easily, if we were to list presidents at inauguration, Herbert Hoover is near the top from a most impressive perspective. Easily, I would actually verge easily top 5. You disagree if you want. I'd love to hear the disagreement. But just when you measure,
you're talking about 1920 when he gets elected.
No, 1929, right? Because
widely admired. Yeah,
several things here. So one, goes to China during the Boxer Rebellion period, learns Chinese. I love the story that just sort of an incredibly smart man, but famously when he and his wife would like to not let the White House servants hear what they were talking about, they would speak in Chinese. He is this very successful businessman. He organizes the defense of the American legation during the Boxer Rebellion. He organizes the feeding of Europe during World War I, and he's an incredibly successful Secretary of Commerce. He elevates that position and makes it significant and makes it deeply, deeply matter for the first time. So once again, this is a deeply impressive man. Yet when he's actually faced by crisis, he fails. I would like to hear, and we could zoom out beyond just Herbert Hoover. I think it's important to set up this history. What distinguishes for you a crisis leader? Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a good book in this topic. What's the difference between a crisis leader and a stability and maintenance leader?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Marshall. So I think you set it up beautifully. You're right. Herbert Hoover, when he's elected, he's, the most widely admired man in America. Built himself up, very impressive in many ways. He's what we would call today, they didn't use the word back then, but he was a brilliant technocrat in a sense. Yep. He was an expert. That's what he was on a various topic. And he did, his resume was very rich. It wasn't a political resume. It was just being a public servant and
hyper competence and rewarded for said competence.
Whereas FDR was a successful governor of New York. He did a good job, and he had been Secretary of the Navy, so he wasn't a nobody. But FDR was widely considered to be a lightweight. I mean, he cruised on his last name. He was the distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He decided when he was very young that he's going to be president based on nothing except his own importance. He was a very mediocre student, right? He didn't. It's not. There's nothing early. He seemed like just a kind of like a rich socialite, frat boy, if you will. So that set up, if Hoover were someone incompetent, unimpressive, unintelligent, he wouldn't be interesting. And I always tell my students, it's not interesting to talk about people who are going, you expect them to fail. No, we expect Hoover to succeed. So we have to explain the failure of such a talented, capable man. And I think part of it is because you said it at the end. There are leaders, I think, who are meant to be leaders in peacetime, the leaders in stability times. And these are good managers. He was an excellent manager. if I had a
FDR
successful company and
FDR is a horrible manager.
Yeah. So FDR, I don't know if he's a horrible manager, but I don't know how if I would like FDR was president. He was elected 4 times by the American people in landslides, and they put in the term limits because he had been elected too many times, and so. But I don't know how he would have. But he was always in a crisis. There was the Depression, and then we had World War II. I don't know how FDR would have functioned in times of peace and stability. There are leaders in history who thrive on crisis and chaos, and they actually do well in those situations. And when those situations don't exist, they go out and create them. And you don't always want that. You don't need to artificially create a crisis, but he inherited that crisis. And that's why he really stepped into his moment. So I think that that's a good distinction. It's a distinction between Hoover, who was in 1928 widely admired, and then in 1929, 1930, he was the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. And when he told the American people prosperity is just around the corner, people just looked at him and said, well, what are you talking about? Prosperity is clearly not just around the corner. And he seemed very glib and aloof. And of course, what he did with the bonus army was very, very bad politics, just kind of burning down their shanty town. These were war veterans, right, who were starving with their families. So that was bad optics. And then and he was paralyzed, right? So he's also had this ideology, the federal government should not intervene in the economy. And, this whole thing of the president having economic positions, right, about how the American economy what it should look like, what the government should do or not do, the budget and all. This is FDR and post-FDR. That's a big change that happens as a result of FDR's presidency that we even have now to this day. So FDR turns out to be the leader that you want, or not that I want or that you want, but that the American people really overwhelmingly wanted in a crisis. And he had his opponents and he had his adversaries, including Hoover himself, who remained a bitter, staunch opponent to the end. But that's, I think, where you get the difference between a crisis leader and a stability leader. And in all honesty, if you look at the book, I'm much more interested in crisis moments because I think that's where significant transformative leadership happens, right? It's really when you look at these moments in history that are of conflict, of crisis, that you see the most significant change happening. And so whether you like FDR or not, some do and some don't, you can't argue with the fact that he completely transformed the country and completely transformed our economy. And later on, there are other leaders who, let's take Margaret Thatcher, who I also write about in the book, very controversial figure and very polarizing. You'll find very few people will say, I have no strong, from that generation will tell you, I have no strong opinion. No, most people will say, oh, I think she's the greatest, leader that we've ever seen. And some people will tell you this is, this woman is pure evil and ruined everything. But that's because she was so impactful in transformation. We live in her world. We live in Thatcher's world today. So these are, and of course, this is emerging from kind of a crisis moment that produces a particular kind of leader who then has the opportunity to make significant change.
Yeah, and quick side note, I wasn't being flippant about referring to FDR as a table manager. My actual area of policy focus is just the arsenal of democracy, World War II era. And FDR, when I say he's a terrible manager in the sense that he's giving 15 different people the same job. Titles mean nothing. The org chart is a disaster. Herbert Hoover would walk in and have a conniption. He's famously, he barely meets with Harry Truman during a period where he is obviously on the decline and is going to need to actually sync with his. So I mean, he was a bad manager, but I think the failure would be in assuming that what America inherently needed in or was asking for in the 30s versus the 40s was a good manager versus someone who gets the big picture questions right, which is what FDR was capable of doing. So once again, different periods and different positions, because once again, FDR was a horrible manager, which is why it mattered that he has George C. Marshall and Henry Stimson. He actually had a variety of hyper competent leaders underneath him. So the structure there is so important. So, okay. So in this last section, I'd like to speak to the current moment. So obviously whether or not President Biden is reelected or Trump comes back, 2028 at a minimum is going to be just moment of peak generational change in this country. So a lot of folks in my cohort, the cohort above mine, and of course, often underappreciated Gen X, are going to attempt to fill the leadership void, often making these generational arguments. I'd like for you to speak to them, especially in the context of your book, referring to this current era as a leadership crisis era. So what void are coming generations expected to fill now?
Yeah. So first, I have to say thanks for giving a shout out to Gen X, the underappreciated Gen X. That's my generation, and I think we're kind of an interesting generation, but mostly because we're so overshadowed. First of all, we had the boomers above us, and they're like, they're the boomers. They're basically, they created and in a way still run this world. They had good music, good movies, but they're, politically it's a disaster. Then we have under us, we have the millennials who are, kind of took us. So we're overshadowed. I think we're an interesting generation, but Generation X is interesting. We didn't actually make that much, if you think about it. Like the political impact, the economic impact, I don't think is the same as above us and below us. That's an interesting thing. As for the future. It's very hard to see 2028, right? Who even knows what's going to happen in 2024 in the election? And there's so much happening, so many as we can see every day, these unpredictable, sometimes catastrophic things happening that just change our perspective on things, right? And we have historians we're really good at looking at the past, but we are very skeptical about making predictions for the future. But I will say this. I think that I'm often asked, who are the leaders of tomorrow? Like, where are they, right? And I say they're actually all around. I think what you said at the beginning, Marshall, is very true in that way. That there's potential leadership. It's just we need to identify people, or we need people to actually identify themselves, present themselves, new kinds of leaders, not the same old mold of leaders, but new kinds of leaders. And really say, well, leadership is not an old-fashioned thing. Leadership is not obsolete. We need leaders to make the kinds of changes that are required. But one thing I think is happening, we learned during COVID, and I think even to the present, that in many ways, I don't think we're set up. Our society is set up for these very serious challenges we face. So this rules via my biases. I think it's insane that national governments are still thinking in terms of national self-interest when we see that a lot of the problems that are coming down the pike don't make any distinctions between nations and don't take borders seriously at all, right? For example, the climate and whatever diseases and pandemics might be coming down the pike, they're not going to ask if you're American or Chinese or Russian or Ukrainian or any of these. They're going to hit us as a species, not as a nation, right? And we can tell ourselves that, we're going to protect ourselves and it's us or them. But I just think that it's becoming less and less convincing to young people in particular, right? So I think a lot of the leaders that are going to hopefully come up in this new moment are going to have to overturn a lot of the kind of commonplace ways of thinking about politics, especially since we have political leaders in our country and all over the world who seem to be more concerned with their very short-term political and even personal interests, rather than these larger questions that interested leaders in history from, Lincoln to FDR to even Thatcher, whether you agree with her or not. She was thinking about big questions. She was thinking about the world at large, right? She was thinking about what is a good society, right? How should people live, right? You can agree or not agree, but these were leaders who tried to address problems at the core. And they weren't just trying to survive. They weren't just trying to get something. They weren't just trying to win the next election. We have problems that transcend one election. We have problems that transcend one country. I know I'm sounding a little bit, I don't know, like a dreamer, maybe it sounds a little childlike, but I really believe that because I teach people from all over the world. And you'd be surprised that when I ask them, list me the problems that you face. It can be in your country, in your city, or whatever it's very similar. People say very, very similar things. It's not, all these divisions tend to be very artificial. So I'm not saying, okay, we're going to knock down borders, but I'm saying, well, we're going to have to think a little bit more collectively, maybe a little bit less individually, a little bit less in terms of my interest versus this person's interest. We're going to have to open that up. And I'm sure those leaders are out there. We have to, whether they're us or someone else, to identify them. We have to help them. We have to encourage them, support them. And if necessary, we have to rally around them.
You know, it's interesting. Your answer actually got to the core of what I think happened with the 2010 social movements that, for various reasons, I would argue failed in their greatest objectives. The reason why they rejected leadership is that they confused the often off-putting and incorrect trappings of leadership. So if I'm in Occupy Wall Street in 2011, if I think of the word leadership, I'm honestly probably thinking of someone in a suit and tie, nice gelled hair, giving a politician-y blathering speech that doesn't really mean anything and saying, oh, we believe in change, but ultimately, let's talk 10 years. Mm. That's probably what you're thinking of. But that's like a trapping. That's performance. Those are conventions. That's different than the act of. And if you, it's kind of funny. You read the post stops on Occupy Wall Street. And for example, a huge problem at Occupy Wall Street was that there was this drum circle. Which the drum circle on the one hand is really cool because it's spontaneous. Everyone's saying, yeah, they're playing the drum circle. But apparently the drum circle would just go on all day. And it like literally disrupted people's ability to sleep. That like led to like antisocial behavior, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm. So leadership in that context isn't about someone putting on their suit and tie and saying, I'll speak to you, Don Lemon at CNN. It's someone saying, hey guys, I love this like drum circle. This is really great. I'm noticing a bunch of people aren't able to like get sleep. Let's maybe get like a schedule together or find a way. That is actually what leadership quite literally is. That's different than like the act of like putting on a suit and tie.
Yeah, I think there's right between those two things, those two models that you just kind of suggested, right? One is this plastic politician type, and the other is the ineffectual, right, activist who's not actually getting anything done. We have to look for something that not combines them, but is not neither this nor that, but knows how to and isn't afraid of wielding power, trying to achieve power, but then does something with that power. I mean, the whole point to me of, I'm not, I think honestly, many liberals are very skeptical of power. They dislike it. They get nervous about it. They're not comfortable with it. And when they have it, they don't, it's like looking for reasons not to use it. Whereas I think a lot of these young people, you're right that they may have rejected that model of the sort of the formal leader, but they definitely want change, right? So it's a matter of finding ways to get people to do that, right? To not just be performative, but also to get things done, but also not to look for excuses to not get things done. And let's not forget, Marshall, we have a problem in American politics. That is, this politician that you kind of, or this person that you described as with a suit saying, this person is to get elected is dependent on donors, and we have a money problem, right? That our whole political system is driven by money, right? And so I think you see there's a story comes up all the time. There's these people who go into politics and they change. They change once they're inside the system, once they get elected, even once they get into Congress, suddenly they fall in line. And I think that young people see that, and they get disappointed and they get disillusioned. And then they fall into your trap, or the trap that you described, which is, these people are all useless, right? Individual leaders, and especially our political leaders, are completely useless. And they're not completely wrong about that, because they get disappointed over and over again. You're talking about Occupy Wall Street. You know what else happened that time? It was Barack Obama who got elected And he got elected on a wave of youthful enthusiasm over the idea of hope and change, right? And then, of course, with the financial crisis and the response to the financial crisis, a lot of the sort of worst fears were confirmed because they bolstered the existing system, which was precisely what a lot of these people were rebelling against and wanted to get rid of. And so once that happened, the scene, okay, here we go again. It's the same old politics. We still like the symbolism of Obama as president. We still like the speeches, but there's no transformation of our country or our political economy or the way we live or our future. And so we really have to move beyond that, I think, and find ways to make people less cynical about leadership. It's not just rejecting a model, Marsha. I think it's a skepticism, a cynicism. And even the older generation, think about people discovering, again, this is from my book, toward the end of the Vietnam War, the American public discovering that their government just lied to them about everything for years, about how they entered the war, about what was happening. And then the President Nixon turns out to be a criminal, a liar, resigns in disgrace, but then gets pardoned by his successor. That just creates a sense of, first of all, there's no accountability, right? And secondly, our own leaders are liars and crooks. So who can we trust, right? We can't trust leaders. We just reject that model entirely. So I'm hoping, and this is part of why I wrote the book, is to bring back the idea that leadership can be transformative. It can lead to positive change. We have to be skeptical of it. We shouldn't be authoritarian. We shouldn't just obey whatever any leader tells us. But we should also understand that without leadership, we don't have significant change happening in our society.
Yeah, and I think just to close, I think what's so well stated there, I love your articulation of the tie between Vietnam and then the 2008 financial crisis, because I understand, having spoken to a lot of younger listeners, how that history is so hobbling, like that history is so demotivational. And I think this is why folks ask, why do so many history episodes here? The reason why I do history episodes is I think that the answer to the demotivation of that history is actually just more history. So you could look at the story of 2009 of Obama and say, okay, well, I guess the political system is ultimately just a total letdown. You're ultimately just kind of like a sheep or naive if you think change happens in that manner. Well, if you actually read the history of that era, it's kind of a tragic history. You just kind of conclude, wow, President Obama had a 59-seat Senate majority that relied on 11 to 12 Democrats who were so conservative that today, if they were in office, they would likely be either Republicans or Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema on steroids. So given that history, unfortunate reality of our world, a transformative presidency on the style of FDR wasn't quite possible. Or another example too, and this is where history is so fascinating. It's like, okay, yeah, FDR is able to put together these big majorities, but inconvenient truth, if you're, particularly to the left, why were those giant transformational majorities possible? Because they deal with the literal devil when it came to civil rights in the Deep South. Like FDR, and once again, I as a Black person and someone who's read history, I think this was a completely, things can be horrific, but ultimately justifiable. And that's kind of my reaction to the deal that was made with the pre-civil rights South. But once again, this is what history is. History is, you pass Social Security because there are 16 additional senators who are good at Social Security. They just don't believe that Black people deserve the same rights as white people. And that's what actual leadership is. Leadership is weighing these. And guess what? I could be convinced that FDR made the wrong call, right? Like maybe even the way that we're telling this history is me being an establishment person saying, well, he ultimately had no choice. But I think if young people would engage more with this history, they'd come away less cynical and just aware of the fact that just as FDR had agency, they have agency. Maybe the world could look different. So that's my just closing thought there.
Yeah. No, I think that's really incisive. So regarding the FDR example is excellent. You're right. So you're referring to the the New Deal coalition, which included, ethnic minorities, working class, rural farmers, and religious minorities, and the so-called Solid South, right, which was segregated, and made sure that put in provisions that a lot of these sort of New Deal acts would have segregation and discrimination built into them. But as you also point out, right, the alternative for especially African Americans, who were by far the poorest in the country and the most suffering under the Great Depression, would have been far worse without any of this action. So that's why FDR was overwhelmingly supported by African Americans to the extent that they could vote. Right, he's the first president who starts driving the vote, the so-called black vote, from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, because if you told them, well, that he's putting provisions in these New Deal acts that maintain discrimination, they would tell you, this is the first president I've had who came and talked to us and listened to what we need, and they actually built these roads next to our town we never had before, and suddenly we have work where we didn't have before, and we've got Social Security. So people were making that trade-off that you're talking about, and they understand within the context of the time that what FDR was doing was ultimately transformative. So I think that you're right. This is what leadership is. He was very ruthless in that way. Similarly, great example is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court kind of opposing him, right, and the so-called court packing scandal, right, 1937. So the way it's all usually presented is the Supreme Court starts saying, well, these New Deal provisions are unconstitutional. And in particular, they were thinking about minimum wage laws, and they were thinking about the unionization, right? So, and these are, of course, the acts of the New Deal that most protected poor people and working people. Now, FDR's reaction to the Supreme Court saying, well, that's unconstitutional, wasn't to say, like a lot of liberals would say, well, Supreme Court that's the highest body in the land, and we must, bow before the Supreme Court, and we'll just give up. No, FDR was saying, oh, really, you think it's unconstitutional? Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to appoint more justices to the Supreme Court until I get a majority that thinks that it is constitutional. Because FDR knew that, what the Supreme Court called constitutional and unconstitutional meant that justices agreed with it or not politically. That's one thing, because that's what constitutional and unconstitutional really means in America. The second thing that he understood was that as president, his primary responsibility was to protect the people that elect the American people from starvation and poverty. Now, a lot of people, especially liberals and also conservatives, would say, well, in this moment, FDR kind of fighting the Supreme Court, he's being authoritarian. He's being a dictator, because the Supreme Court is a bedrock of our democracy. And that's often how it's been viewed. But the other way to look at it is to say, wait a minute, is the point of our democracy just the maintenance of institutions and their relationships, or is it about really heeding what the people voted for and what they want, right? And they voted overwhelmingly for FDR and for the New Deal. So I think FDR had that view, and he was thinking, this deal with the devil, how do I protect the system? How do I protect democracy? How do I protect capitalism in a world, the 1930s, where all of this is being overturned? There's fascism on the rise. There's communism on the rise. So he makes that decision. And in the end, it worked, because the Supreme Court changed its mind. And they say, oh, actually, it is constitutional. So I think FDR in that sense is also controversial, because a lot of people accused him of being anti-democratic. Well, a lot of others said, no, actually what he was doing was protecting democracy from the larger threat, right? So a leader has to adapt to his or her time, even if, the acts can be controversial or ruthless.
I think that is an excellent place to end the conversation. The reference to history and broader, more timeless ideas about leadership that I think get to the core of both your teaching, but the book itself. Thank you so much for joining me on The Realignment. This has been fun.
Thank you so much for having me, Marshall.